Welcome to Disaffected. I'm Joshua Slocum, and this is the show where we talk about politics, culture, and relationships through a psychological lens. It is February 2nd, 2025, and as you can see, we're getting closer with the studio. Every week brings a little bit more. Bear with us. It'll look even spiffier next week. Later on in the show, we're going to be joined for an interview with blogger, writer, and sometime podcaster Kate Wand, who writes the Substack Unorthodox Opinions. And we're going to talk about her perspective as a mother in the millennial generation, having baby boomer parents, and the sorts of narcissism and emotional problems that often crop up for children of boomers. So stick around for that. But we're going to talk in the first section about the Trump administration executive orders. It's impossible to keep up with them. They're just coming so thick and so fast. Is it dozens or hundreds in the first few weeks? I have lost count. So far, I haven't seen any that I have any disagreement with, and we're going to highlight some of those with emphasis on the most important of them, the executive order against gender transitioning children. First, though, it is true that we should not be running a constitutional republic on executive orders, one person, one CEO executive orders. The president is supposed to be an executive, not a monarch. We are supposed to be governed by laws, not by writs from the king. But as writer Chris Bray notes on Substack, Donald Trump did not create this political situation. He's not responsible for the place that we're in, and he has no other choice but to issue these orders. That is how you exercise power in the political moment that we are in. Do we want to rein in the presidency broadly? Yes, I think we do. I think we should. But don't ask Donald Trump to beat his sword into a plowshare and not exercise this power. That's not a rational and it's not a reasonable request. It's not rising above. It's not being the bigger person. It's allowing leftist bullies and narcissists to beat you and cut you with a sword while refusing to use your own sword to defend yourself. We're going to have to find a way out of this by other means, but yeah, we've got to use these executive orders. And yes, it's also likely that there are going to be oodles of court cases testing these executive orders. Yes, there are going to be huge congressional fights over what gets codified permanently into law. And most of these issues should be addressed by statute. That is law enacted by Congress, not by a memo from the president himself. That's normal. Just because those fights are going to come up, and they are, doesn't mean, well, he shouldn't have done this. No, this is how it works. So prepare yourself. The executive orders in our current context are the only way to force these issues to be dealt with. It's an opening salvo. And I'm very thankful that he's forcing all of these issues. Finally, how long have we waited? Let's take a look at the issues covered by these orders broadly. Then we'll get into the trans kid specific order. The information I'm about to give you comes largely from a list compiled by The Guardian, but by the time you watch this episode, it will almost certainly be out of date. So these are the subjects: housing 30,000 illegal aliens, the worst of the worst, at the prison in Guantanamo Bay. Good. Next one, banning transgender people from military service. Good. Why is it good? So I know even some people who largely agree with me on these things are having a hard time with this one. Here's why it's good. Because there is no such thing and no such kind of person as a stable, healthy, normal, competent person who just happens to be trans. That's not a kind of person that exists in the way it never has existed. And by definition, it can't exist. Believing that you are born in the wrong body to the degree that you feel compelled to take hormones and have surgery, and or to require everyone around you, including your commanding officers, your colleagues, and your subordinates, to pretend that you are a sex you are not, along with you in your fantasy game, on pain of getting fired or sued or discharged. That is the definition of mental instability and mental illness. Definitionally. No such thing as a otherwise normal in every single way, metabolically, physically, and mentally but just trans. There's no such thing as trans. Trans itself is a mental illness. It's actually diagnostic, in most cases we're talking about here, of a cluster B personality disorder. That is not a recipe for stability. None of them, not one single person, is mentally or physically qualified to be in the military. They never should have been there. I'm not mentally or physically qualified to be in the military. Many of you aren't either. Get this howler from PBS. This is 101, Kevin. Headline: Trump aims to push transgender troops out of the military. Identifying people will be complicated. Really? Have you seen them? Don't believe your lying eyes. How do you know their gender if you don't ask? How do you know? Why are you speculating about their genitals when you can't know? Yeah, I can. Yeah, I can know because I have eyes and ears and a nose. You see, it's going to take time for leftists like this to figure out that this kind of doolally nuttiness isn't working anymore. Identifying people will be very complicated as they all pass so well. Next one: develop an Iron Dome missile defense system for America like what Israel has. Maybe a good idea. Next one: reviewing the effectiveness of the Federal Emergency Management Agency. Let's get it started yesterday. Remember that this is the agency that is apparently doing very, very little to help actual Americans through natural disasters like Hurricanes Helene and Milton, cutting off the funding in North Carolina for people who are living in temporary housing, and appropriating millions and millions and millions and millions of dollars from the FEMA budget to pay for housing illegal aliens. Yeah, let's go through it. Let's see what FEMA really does, and maybe let's shut down that organization. Then we move into declassifying the Martin Luther King and John F. Kennedy assassination files. I don't really care about this because if you believe the government is actually going to voluntarily turn over any records that show any government complicity, I don't know what to tell you, because that's not going to happen. Then we have an order reviewing AI technology and the crypto industry. Okay. We have an order to examine the possibility of ending birthright citizenship. What is meant by birthright citizenship is that anyone who is physically born on American land therefore becomes a citizen permanently. I think we do need to re-examine that idea. The idea that if you're born here, regardless of whether your parents themselves are illegal aliens, that you become a citizen and therefore they get to stay here too, that does need to be reviewed. That's not reasonable. And enough legal scholars apparently agree that this is not the clear-cut constitutional issue that people are making it out to be. And I've been convinced by this. I don't know what the answer is. I think this is one of those constitutional questions that really does need to be tested out in court with advocates giving their best argument from either side. I'm undecided about this, but I don't believe that it's clear-cut in the Constitution. So I think it is, as they say, ripe for review. We have an order freezing refugees from coming into the United States. But what does The Guardian have to say about that? Freezing, stopping people claiming refugee status for coming into the United States? Well, they have no care at all for America's interests. They just make the assumption that America is morally obligated to care for the rest of the world's poor. Graphic 102, Kevin, here's from The Guardian. Guardian says, what this means. Advocates say the move puts lives in danger and has left families devastated. Thousands of refugees now stranded around the globe. So what? So what? Why is that America's problem? It's not. It never has been. This is a form of white guilt. You understand that, right? Well, we have to take them all in because they're a country. Why? Is every household that doesn't have 4 children obligated to adopt 3 children because other people can't take care of them? It's nonsense. It's insane. Then we have an order directing the U.S., and I think this has already been accomplished, to leave the World Health Organization. Good. And Trump took back the name Mount McKinley in Alaska and renamed the body of water off Texas, Alabama, Georgia, and Florida as the Gulf of America. Good. You may not remember this because our memories are very, very short, but it was only around 2011 or 2012. It was the Barack Obama did this. Everyone instantly started calling that Alaskan mountain that has always been known as Mount McKinley since President McKinley's name was lent to it. They instantly started calling it Denali. Denali. As soon as Barack Obama said, that's its indigenous name, everybody's like, okay, yeah, Denali, that mountain, and Denali. Who cares? Which indigenous name? Which set of indigenous people? Show me their title deed to the land. This is our mountain because it lives within the United States. Alaska is a state in the United States. Its name is Mount McKinley. And the Gulf of America, now I objected to this at first. My first reaction was that it seemed calculated to simply upset people and troll them. But then I changed my mind. I approve of a calculated move to upset people and troll them over things like this. I think that is a good thing. People upset by naming that body of water after our country need to have their phobia and their contempt for our own nation and the name of our nation provoked. That needs to be provoked. They need to have a tantrum about that. And people need to see their contempt and disdain for their own country. So if it's only a trolling move, good, I'm behind it. The deliberate provocation is a good thing and a necessary thing. You don't make deals and you don't change culture by coming in soft and lowballing the other guy and hoping he's going to be nice to you. That's how you get taken advantage of. Then we have an order to remove President Biden's mandate that all cars sold in the U.S. by 2030 be electrical vehicles. Good. The president should never. That is an example of how abusive and monarchical these executive orders have become. Why should one man who has been hired by the country to be the CEO, that is literally what the president is. It is a 4-year term as CEO of this country. We hired them. Why should one manager, which is what the president is, have the right to write law and say every American manufacturing company must make electric vehicles and it has to make 50% of them, and those are the only kind that customers can buy? This is bloody outrageous. Frankly, it's outrageous if Congress were to pass such a law, but to have it come from one man's desk, unacceptable. Here's the Guardian on what that means. The next one I was going to mention. Order forcing all federal employees back to the physical office to work in the office or they're fired. I love it. But the Guardian doesn't. Graphic 103, please, Kevin. Key aides to Trump have called for mass government firings. Project 2025 made attacks on the deep or administrative state a core part of Trump's second term. The right-wing playbook called for civil servants deemed politically unreliable to be fired or replaced by conservatives. Yes, good. Good. Do you actually expect, if a Democrat got into the federal government right now, no Democrat would be screaming at him if he got out all of the conservatives who were working against his agenda? Do you scream at CEOs who fire insubordinate employees? If not, why not? Because you should, if you're going to be consistent. And finally, this one, this is graphic 104, rescinding 78 Biden-era executive actions. This is the Guardian again. Trump ordered 78 Biden-era executive actions to be rescinded, including at least a dozen measures supporting racial equity and combating discrimination against gay and transgender people. Again, good. No, these weren't about combating unjust discrimination. Not true. They were about favoring minorities and malcontents and the incompetent based on their skin color or who they sleep with. Good riddance. Sorry, Black Americans, but you are not going to get your equity anymore. That shit is over. He declared a national border emergency and he pardoned the January 6 convicted people, and that is also good. The vast majority of the more than 1,500 people who were sitting in jail some of whom had not even been prosecuted in 4 years. Talk about denying their constitutional right to a speedy trial. The vast majority of these people did not do anything but walk through the Capitol building, often at the invitation of DC police officers. I'm not making it up. You can watch the tapes yourself. You can see that this is what actually happened. And the violent vandals, and there were violent vandals, and they absolutely were correct. It was right to prosecute them. It was right to put them in jail for destroying property or for assaulting anyone, including any police officers. But there were very few of them, and most of those have already served more prison time than almost anyone convicted of a similar crime of vandalism or assault that didn't happen to be a J6er. This was absolutely political prosecution. It was bills of attainder, is what it was. Those, I'm not going to get into that. I've told you guys this before, but one of my side interests is the Tudor dynasty in late medieval and early modern England. I've read voraciously about it. I continue to, and it is so easy to see the kinds of abuses that the court of Henry VII, Henry VIII, Mary I, Edward was it seventh, and then Elizabeth I engaged in, that formed the kinds of things that the founding fathers of the United States deliberately made illegal in our Constitution. Bills of attainder were bills that could be brought forward specifically to target an individual, making sure that that individual was thrown into the tower or thrown in prison, didn't have to have a trial. That's basically what we've been doing here. These trials are not trials. There's so many more. We can't go through them all. And I want to take a look at the most important executive order, which is this one, Graphic 105, Protecting Children from Chemical and Surgical Mutilation. Audience, this is what we have been waiting for years. This is the first time a public official in the United States has told the plain, unvarnished truth about the worst child abuse and medical scandal in our history. Let's read through some of that order. Quote 106, please, Kevin. Policy and purpose. Across the country today, medical professionals are maiming and sterilizing a growing number of impressionable children under the radical and false claim that adults can change a child's sex through a series of irreversible medical interventions. This dangerous trend will be a stain on our nation's history, and it must end. Next quote. Countless children soon regret that they have been mutilated and begin to grasp the horrifying tragedy that they will never be able to conceive children of their own or nurture their own children through breastfeeding. Moreover, these vulnerable youth's medical bills may rise throughout their lifetimes as they are often trapped with lifelong medical complications, a losing war with their own bodies, and tragically, sterilization. I think we've heard that word so many times that people forget how permanent it is. This is not a temporary loss of fertility. Sterilization is permanent, permanently removing the ability of the child to have his own child or her own child. Yeah. Quote 108, please. Accordingly, it is the policy of the United States that it will not fund, sponsor, promote, assist, or support the so-called, quote, transition of a child from one sex to another, and it will rigorously enforce all laws that prohibit or limit these destructive and life-altering procedures. Notice the language: mutilated, horrifying tragedy, radical and false claims, sterilization. Sounds harsh, doesn't it? Yeah. Well, cutting off a 14-year-old breasts is what's harsh. Preventing puberty by chemically castrating a 10-year-old boy with the same drugs that we use to chemically castrate sex offenders in prison is what's actually harsh. Not the words, the reality. The left is out there pretending to faint about all this hurtful language, but like all cluster B cultists, they don't actually care about the measurable real-world brutality and destruction that's being visited on children. They only care about the words that make them have bad feels because they pull the mask off and they show the actual abuse for what it is. And that's not very nice and doesn't feel good. This executive order also ends the use of guidelines from the World Professional Association for Transgender Health, or WPATH. Good. We told you last week about that organization, which has participants from the 80s and 90s who worked in the recovered memory syndrome fraud are on WPATH's board. Is it any surprise that they believe also in children born in the wrong body and want to see more of them? Good. Quote 109, please. Defunding chemical and surgical mutilation. The head of each executive department or agency that provides research or education grants to medical institutions, including medical schools and hospitals, shall, consistent with applicable law and in coordination with the director of the Office of Management and Budget, immediately take appropriate steps to ensure that institutions receiving federal research or education grants end the chemical and surgical mutilation of children. So, what does this order do and what does it not do? It cannot override state laws that permit this abuse, and about half the United States do permit this abuse under law. Well, not really, but I'll get to that in a minute. I hope that will come later with a federal statutory ban that overrides state law. But this executive order can and will stop any hospital or similar facility from doing this because all their federal tax money will be yanked. And these people only care about money and power and self-aggrandizement. You cut those things off and their behavior will change. Remove the incentive. You running a hospital right now with a pediatric gender clinic? What a disgusting and foul. And I can't believe that I have to say those words, pediatric gender clinic. I hope your insurance is very good because you're going to go down in flames. And you should rot in prison for the rest of your life. If you have participated in putting a child on puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, or surgery, you should rot in prison for the rest of your life without parole. Frankly, I think that's generous. It also stops Medicaid, this executive order, from paying for any of this bullshit. It stops military insurance for paying for any of this. And check out this part. This is quote 110. Section 8, directives to the Department of Justice. The Attorney General shall review Department of Justice enforcement of Section 116 of Title 18, United States Code, and prioritize enforcement of protections against female genital mutilation, and convene states' attorneys general and other law enforcement officers to coordinate the enforcement of laws against female genital mutilation across all American states and territories. Remember about 20 years ago when Democrats were in an outcry about female genital mutilation? The Muslim kind that cuts off the clitoris and sews up the labia into a really small hole that only a little bit of pee can get through. Remember how passionate they were that this was a crime and it shouldn't be done to girls? And then did you notice that as soon as genital mutilation and the equivalent was done for what they called trans care or gender affirming care, that all of a sudden it was blessed and sacred to do this to children's bodies? This is the first time anyone has made that extraordinarily obvious connection in the federal government. Gender affirming care is genital mutilation, female or male. Oh, yeah. We need some. The reason this doesn't mention male genital mutilation is because we live in a patriarchy and men get everything they want, right? No, it's because we ignore what happens to boys. We don't care what happens to little boys the way we do about girls. We have routine infant circumcision, removing the foreskin of boys' penises. That is genital mutilation, even if it's not as severe as what's called infibulation and the removal of the clitoris in girls, but it is genital mutilation. How many of you right now want to object to me? Because every time I bring that up, every time I see a man bring this up, I hear women screaming that you're taking away from the pain of female genital mutilation. Ladies, does it ever bother you that it's completely obvious, those of you who react this way, that you don't give one single shit about little boys? Because it should bother you. Do you know what else about all this? All of this gender affirming care is already against the law. It's another connection nobody's made. Do you know that? Do you understand why it's against the law? Because child abuse is against the law. This is how fragile our laws are. People can simply decide based on fleeting and changeable opinions about social fads that illegal things are no longer illegal, immoral things are no longer immoral, destructive and brutal things are no longer destructive and brutal, and they can do whatever they want because I said it was to give them care. I said I was caring. Do we need a specific law that specifically says Munchausen by proxy treatment of children is against the law, including giving healthy children cancer drugs when they don't have cancer, and including confining them to a wheelchair when they can actually walk? Of course, we don't need that law. No one is saying we can't investigate this kind of child abuse until we have a specific named law that specifically details the specific physical acts, each and every one of them. And if it's not enumerated, then it's legal. That is not how the law works, but that is how we've been treating the law. So why do we think that we have to wait for a special new specific enumerated law to stop the mutilation of children when we call it gender affirming care? Someone answer this for me, please. Anyone give me a theory. You can't, because there isn't one. It looks like the Trump administration may be aware of the fact that what half the states are permitting to be done to children is already and obviously against extant child abuse laws. The following section is beautiful. Actually, I think I already read it to you. I think this executive order is the start of something great and something long overdue. But expect a years-long fight. Expect temporary reversals in courts and in state legislatures and in Congress. That is going to happen. That's how this works. But we're already making progress. You can bet there are gender clinics. There are hundreds of them. The last time I checked, there were at least 300 pediatric gender clinics in the United States. Let that sink in. You can bet that they are already, right now as we speak, trying to figure out how to either shut down or legally cover their asses. Many of them are voluntarily going to go out of business in the coming months and years, even before any of this is codified into law. The pressure of what's coming legally will be enough. So that's already beginning to happen, I am certain. And over the next few years, the entire public, everyone, is going to be horrified by this. It's going to become socially verboten to even suggest doing this to a child, just like it always was until the past 10 to 15 years. The market is going to dry right up. And please do not carp and complain about the tone in these executive orders. That shit is over. Using a nice tone, using euphemisms is exactly how we ended up cutting teen boys' balls off and permanently sterilizing children and slicing the breasts off pubescent girls because we were nice and we didn't want to say what it actually was. We've needed a direct, uncompromising, masculine daddy approach to this issue for years, and now it's here. No, we're not going to be nice. We're not going to be compassionate. This is what he's doing. Actually, this is an act of love. This is compassion and love, real love in action. Saving children is compassion and love. But we're not going to spare the feelings of the adults who did this. So get that out of your fucking mind. And you are welcome. Anyone out there, you are welcome for what President Trump is doing to protect your children, even if you don't have the sense to be grateful for it. Now, we're coming up on a break, but after that, we're going to be joined by Substack writer and sometime podcaster Kate Wand. She's a millennial who's really a Gen Xer. I have elevated her to Gen X status. Kate has been writing about what it's like to come from a narcissistic family system and how that affected her own parenting, her ideas of career, home, family, and about the narcissism and the emotional immaturity of the baby boom generation, how that has resulted in incompetent, fearful, and unstable millennials. So we'll see that after the break. But we're going to take you out by saying thank you to our sponsor, Anton's Biltong. What is Biltong? The most delicious beef jerky, so to speak, you've ever had, except it's not. It's thinly sliced vinegar and spice cured meat packed by this family business that is a wonderful snack. Kevin and I were eating it several days ago while we were working on the studio. It's packed full of protein. It's got good animal fat, no carbohydrates. And I want to, you know what? One of our viewers recently went and ordered some biltong, and she gave me a good idea, which I'm going to do here. I often forget to tell you, but Anton and his family not only make and ship biltong, but they have a small store that has a wonderful selection of European groceries like Marmite, Bird's Custard from the UK, other things I haven't heard of. But if you are a European here in Canada or America and you want a little taste of home, first of all, go to biltongusa.com. You'll find it there. But look on his grocery section, because there are things you can get shipped to you that you probably haven't had since you were over in the UK. And of course, for our viewers and listeners, we have a discount. Simply use the code JOSH10 to get 10% off your order. Come back for our interview with Kate Wand.
Disaffected is now streaming on X. Come with us each Sunday and dare to notice reality. You can find us on X at DisaffectedPod.
Welcome back. I am delighted to welcome a guest to the show. Her name is Kate Wand. She is a podcaster, a blogger, a former flight attendant, and I have immediately, of course, forgotten the wonderful word she uses for this, so she's going to have to tell us when she comes in. But she is, Gen X adjacent. She's a millennial who has started to notice some of the problems of millennial culture, some of the deficiencies that Boomer and Gen X parents displayed when they were raising millennials. And now that she has a family of her own, she's starting to talk about it. And she also has a background, unfortunately, that includes some familiarity with Cluster B. So we're kind of new to each other, but we're finding lots of common ground. Kate Wand, welcome to Disaffected.
Thank you so much, Joshua. It is great to be here.
So why don't we set it up, since you're new to the audience, give us a little bit of your background. I told people you used to be a flight attendant. I guess I should say you used to be a liberal, got some experience with Cluster B in the family. Tell us the canned Kate story.
Okay, I'll try to keep it canned. So basically, I grew up thinking I have a pretty normal life, pretty normal family. I was a little bit of a John Bennett style child where I was put into music lessons very early on. I had some innate talent. But that came with its own problems and anxieties around performance and things like that. And I went on throughout my whole childhood up until university studying classical music, more specifically opera. And after a certain point, I realized I was in university. I didn't want to be an opera singer. I wasn't really sure what to do next. So I took a gig as a flight attendant, and this gig, of course, turned into a kind of shell career. And it was something that was fun for the first year or two. But after that, it's not really conducive to a healthy lifestyle. That's my opinion. I know many people do this for years and years and years, but it's, to me, kind of a form of escapism. And it's also very difficult to have normal relationships. And so while I was in that phase of my life in my 20s, I was also what you would call a liberal by default, I think maybe was the term you were searching for. And so this just means that I was kind of liberal, in the classical sense, deep down, meaning you get to do what you want, I get to do what I want, and we don't really disturb each other. But of course, the culture around me was more kind of progressive liberal. So I picked up on a lot of those cues as well, feminism, things like that. And so that kind of informed as well the way that I saw relationships, the way that I saw men, and the way that I saw how you should go about deciding what to do with your life. And I found myself on this path where I didn't feel like I was really fulfilling my potential in so many different ways. And part of this was sparked by some bad relationships or situationships and noticing some narcissistic traits in the people that I was involved with. And then thinking to myself, well, maybe you're the common denominator. Like you're attracting these types of people.
Kate, saying that to yourself, maybe I'm the common denominator.
Yes. I thought that to myself. I said, it's the problem is not just out there. I was always very emotionally self-aware. I was kind of into armchair psychology from a very young age. And a lot of that had to do with dealing with family members. I would tell them things like, your feelings are your feelings, my feelings are my feelings. I'm not responsible for your feelings. So I was already doing that as a child. And so I kind of had that self-awareness and that openness. So even though I was choosing the wrong kinds of people and doing things that were self-destructive, I had enough common sense to realize you've got to look inwards and figure out what's going on here. And so when I did, I started to think, oh, well, this person's kind of narcissistic. It was my first introduction to that concept. Oh, but that also reminds me of some family members or some of the dynamics within my family of origin and other relationships and friendships. And that was when I started to kind of come out of that. And not long after that, maybe 2 or 3 years after that, is when I met my now husband. And that kind of helped to boost me into a healthier direction. It gave me the inspiration, that love, and that understanding from him to really kind of get my act together. And my life has changed a lot since then.
Now, I should tell the audience that this conversation that you're listening to, watching with me and Kate, is kind of just a teaser, because we've got we went for an hour and 45 minutes on audio that's going to be coming out soon, where we get really deeply into this. But I wanted to introduce Kate on the flagship show, as it were, and get people interested. When you and I were talking for the audio episode, I'm gonna ask you one of the questions I asked you there. At what point in your life did you become aware? So you talked a minute ago about meeting some boyfriends, noticing some narcissistic traits in them, asking yourself, what am I contributing to this? Why am I attracting this? Those sorts of questions. At what point in your life, how old were you when you first had the conscious awareness that, hey, my family of origin, my immediate family, we had cluster B narcissism problems there, and that explains some of this stuff. When did you first really consciously understand that?
I think with that label, it came a little bit later. It probably came after there was kind of a mass scapegoating, family mobbing event around the time that I met my husband. Before that, I was cognizant that there was some kinds of intergenerational trauma, maybe. My great-grandparents on my mother's side were refugees from the Soviet Union. They had left there in 1930s, had family and young children and husbands die over there. And so there was definitely a lot of trauma, and a lot of family enmeshment, I think, resulted from that trauma. But it took me a while to really accept it and to name it differently. And I think that, like for so many people, it's still something that you can struggle with. You think, oh, does it have to be defined this way or that way? And I'm kind of interested now in figuring out what really motivates people and what really affected me. And that was actually what I had done at the time. I said, okay, how am I affected by my family of origin, by this nuclear family? That happened, I think, around the time that I was 30. I'm 37 now. Yeah.
37 now. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
You're actually, when I talk to clients in one-on-one counseling, consulting, almost all of them feel that they say something like, I should have learned this earlier. This should have been obvious to me years and years ago. I'm embarrassed that I'm now in middle age and I didn't understand any of that. And what I say to them, because from my experience, you, Kate, got an early jump on this. There are some people like you, but most people, in my experience, including myself, it wasn't until we hit our 40s or sometimes our 50s that we really began to understand precisely what was wrong with our family. I don't know if it was like this for you, but when, as the audience knows, I have a mother with, huge borderline and narcissistic personality disorder traits. And when I was a kid, I knew my mother was crazy. I did know that. And when I was a young person and a teenager, I was institutionalized. I was taken out of the home. And I was very cognizant that there was something deeply wrong with my mother. But I didn't know what it was. And then I spent many years as an adult sort of ignoring that and retconning the past. I didn't have a name for it. But when I was young, I would think to myself, I can't invite friends over because my mom's crazy, but she's crazy in this unique way that I will never be able to explain to other people. I don't know how I'll explain to my friend Tom. If my mom starts screaming about where I put something on the counter, I won't know what to tell him, right? So I didn't invite kids over because I thought, my mom is this singular weird creature that no one else on earth has ever been like. That it wasn't until I was in my 40s when I started looking around and I was like, no, this isn't just our family. It's not just my mother. This is a known psychological phenomenon. It has a name, it has a taxonomy, and it has a logic to it. It's not a pretty thing to learn about, but actually learning that this was a known psychological state was a relief to me. When you started to realize that there were dysfunctional things going on in your family, I think one of the differences you've talked about before is, in some families like mine, the way I describe my mother, the behavior is more florid and obvious. People from outside the home can see it, but you've described your own family as much more polished on the surface. Engaged in the community, as you said, and you've described the behaviors that went on at home as more covert. And I think, yes, that is more difficult to deal with. When you can see the problem obviously on the surface and other people can see it, you get that validation. But when other people don't see it, I don't know what your experience was. I mean, because there have been some covert narcissism problems in my family, but when I have experienced that, I find it even more frustrating. Because not only do people outside not necessarily see what I see, but then I start second guessing myself and saying, do you see what you see? Is this really what's happening? How's it been for you?
Yes, I would say that that's exactly it. It's something that I've struggled with. It's something that I still struggle with to a degree. I mean no harm to anybody in the family that I grew up in. I'm not estranged from them. I've had periods of estrangement with them before. But I've managed to get my point across to them as well and have, kind of put my perspectives in front of them, even though, of course, it's something that they don't want to hear or don't want to see, and kind of renegotiated the relationship after having done that and after a long period of separation. So it makes things more complex for me, I think. But at the same time, as I was saying, I have a friend who had a very similar kind of upbringing to yours in the sense that it was overt, the behaviors from her mother, from her father, from her brother. I mean, most people in the community could see as well, like this is kind of a problem family in a sense. But she also does struggle with similar things to me, meaning you kind of auto gaslight yourself. Sometimes you think, oh, it wasn't that bad, or maybe this person was better than this person. And it's kind of like these defense mechanisms come in to defend the reputations in your own head, in your own mind of the people in your family of origin. And I think the whole point is to understand yourself better, to say, okay, there's obviously some things that I absorbed, some things that shaped my personality, that shaped who I am, my conditioning. And there are things that are not so good for me that I need to learn how to shed. So in order to do that, I need to examine, and look for patterns. As you were saying, when you discovered with your mom, oh, there's a textbook behavior for this kind of personality. So for me, it was kind of about doing that, saying, okay, well, this sounds like a mix of this and a mix of this, and this person is kind of like this, and the whole family system together has some intergenerational trauma. There are some things going on from both sides, really trying to analyze things in a way that I could find a way to help myself and to also have the courage to create healthy separation, and not be so enmeshed in that system. It was very important to me. For example, when I was pregnant, nobody in my family knew. It was very important for me that that was something that I did by myself with my new family, with my husband, that I was empowered when I was going to give birth, that I didn't feel like all of this kind of psychic drama was going on, or that I would have to worry about how anybody was going to deal with it. So once I kind of got past these milestones on my own and had enough separation, I was able to say, okay, I can come back and not necessarily be in the same system as I was before, but still have contact with my family of origin, still have relationships to varying degrees with each individual, but no longer be enmeshed and pulled into all of that dysfunction. And when I see cluster B behaviors among family members, I can say, okay, this is what this is. And I can see it more clearly, and then I can put a limit there.
Well, interestingly, I say, of course, you met your husband, and then I think you discovered that there might be a reason why the two of you found each other, because you found yourself dealing with some cluster B with your in-laws, did you not?
Yes, I did. And again, this was something that I wrote about on my Substack. So anybody who's interested can go read there. There are certain details that are behind the paywall for a reason. I wrote specifically, actually, in a piece called what was it? The Millennial Boomer Dance.
Yeah, this is the one that I would really like to. I mean, Kate's podcast, excuse me, her Substack, her blog there is Unorthodox Opinions on Substack, and I do highly recommend it. The story I want to focus on here is an anecdote that you told in your piece titled "Why Millennials Are Messed Up."
Yes, and that's the one.
The themes are very immature behavior from adults, middle-aged and older adults, making children in the family responsible for coddling and protecting the feelings of the adults rather than the other way around. So we got some parentification. Do you want to tell the story, the anecdote from that, with the conflict with your mother-in-law?
Yes. Well, in that story, I describe a scenario where my mother-in-law was being very intrusive with my 3-year-old multiple times on multiple occasions. And he was like, stop. It was bothering him. And something interesting happened to me.
Physically intrusive, or
sometimes physically, like poking, but emotionally intrusive and demanding, and always in his face. And the way that I approach parenting, and my husband and I approach parenting, is that we respect, and we've respected our son since he was born as an autonomous individual. And we hope to develop a relationship with him that he's going to want to continue throughout his life. So we don't feel like he owes us something because we brought him into the world. But of course, this is a worldview that a lot of the older generations, specifically I spoke about boomers in my piece, tend to have.
Yeah, and sorry to interject, but I really want to underline that point for people. Many of you listening who have boomer parents like we do will understand this. My mother, when she would get, when I would try to criticize her and erect a boundary and say, you can't push here, you can't interfere here, one of the responses I would get is, how dare you? I gave you life. I brought you into the world. How dare you tell me any of this? So that sort of, you owe me something because I gave birth to you, is a trait that I see among a lot of very self-centered boomer parents. But I also want to say for the audience, I don't want them to mistake you for one of those people who is an advocate of what they call gentle parenting. Kate is not a parent who has no boundaries or who lets her child decide whether he wants to brush his teeth. That is not what she's talking about. So I just want to make sure that people. But go on and tell that story, the rest of that story with your mother-in-law and your son.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's important to delineate. You don't want to be neglectful, because that's being a neglectful parent when you just give your child full reign to do everything. I mean, you have to lead by example. You have to give them boundaries. You have to give them limits. Sometimes it's, okay, we're going to do this now because it's time to do this now. But there's a lot of expressions that the boomer generation had. It's like a cultural narcissism almost. And they believed that their children owed them something. And to me now as a mother, it's not something that I can imagine. Like, it's clearly cluster B behavior to think that you decided to do something that would bring a child into the world. Your child had no choice in that. And then suddenly there they are, and you get to just shit all over them and blame them for whatever you want, and manipulate them, and to try and induce shame in them so that they comply with you. I think that that's horrific behavior. And so these were the types of mannerisms and behaviors that my mother-in-law was using. And it wasn't coming from my father-in-law. So it's not only a boomer thing. As I said, it's kind of a cultural narcissism thing, but there are definitely there's an individual element there too with this individual, my mother-in-law. And so she was saying things and doing things that were harmful to my son. And I could tell that they were harmful because they made me feel bad inside. I felt anxious. I was wearing my Apple Watch and my heart rate is usually like 65 beats per minute. It went up to 139.
Give us specific.
So basically one day she says, okay, do you want to come play with me? And my son is there playing by himself. And he's like, no. And he's 3. So it's not necessarily like, no, thank you. It's just no. And then she goes, oh, you're making me feel so bad. How am I going to get you to play with me? Blah, blah. And she just goes on. And this very infantile voice, and infantilizing to him at the same time, like treating him like a baby who has no agency of his own. Of course, he's a 3-year-old, so he has limited agency, but he still has some. And just trying to induce guilt and shame in him and manipulate him into doing what he did not want to do so that she could feel better. And it just drove me crazy, because I'm like, how is a 3-year-old there to take care of the feelings of a 65 plus year old? This is not the way that it should work. And it also triggered me because it's reminiscent of something that I've experienced in my own family of origin, very parentified, the emotional caretaker, the person who was kind of conditioned that if you said no, there would be consequences. If you didn't take care of mom and dad's feelings, there would be consequences, or your siblings or everybody else. And so I was very adamant that I didn't want my son to have to deal with those kinds of things. So I'm there as his mother to put up the limits, put up the wall for him, and to tell her no. And so I pulled her aside afterwards and I said, look, you can't do these kinds of things with my son. And I tried to have a very rational conversation with her and say, we're raising our son so that he's able to say no appropriately, and so that he understands kind of his own limits. And we don't want him to feel obliged to take care of your feelings. And she basically, I wrote in the text, her eyes glazed over and she wasn't listening to me at all. She just went into self-defense mode, and basically just said, well, if he doesn't want to play with me and I ask him, that means he's being disrespectful. And I was like, I don't understand how that's disrespect. That's not the definition of respect or disrespect. It's simply somebody stating their preferences. And they shouldn't be guilted, no matter if they're 3 or if they're 60 or if they're 40 or if they're 35. When you state your preferences, and this is the lesson we're trying to teach him, you should respect that. That's respect, right? And so we kind of went in this circular conversation. And afterwards, she backed off, but backed off in such a way that she started to give the cold shoulder. She started to ignore my whole nuclear family, including my son, which is also very confusing, for 2 or 3 days. And then finally came back and basically bribed him with a toy and said, okay, but now you have to give me a hug. And I was like, oh no, I'm not having this kind of thing. And then this just continued over time. So they're patterns of behavior that you try to have a conversation with somebody about, to say, look, maybe this is the way that you grew up. Maybe this is the way that you raised your kids, but this is not what we're doing. So we're just going to ask you to try and follow our lead here. And some people, they're just not capable of doing that, because everything, and you could tell with this individual, and you could tell with narcissistic people, everything is about protecting their own fragile sense of self, their ego. Yes. Everything is about that. So a 3-year-old can totally destroy their feelings because they're so dependent on the approval of everybody, including toddlers.
Well, and there are many elements of tragedy to this, and the circumstances that create the cluster B mind are tragic. Most of the, your parents-in-law, my parents, there were reasons they came out this way. They had neglect or abuse or dysfunction of this type when they were children too. And the tragedy of this is, we talked about this, audience. Kate and I got into this more deeply on the audio show that's coming out very soon. But one of the ways of describing cluster, there's a lot of ways of describing this mindset. Cluster B is one word that we use. Some people use religious terms. They talk about evil, they talk about envy, they talk about the influence of Satan. We can talk about it in terms of cult behavior, authoritarian behavior. These are all accurate words to describe basically the same mindset. But the one that I want to highlight here is an accurate way to describe the cluster B mind is profound emotional immaturity. When you see 60-year-olds, 65-year-olds, 70-year-olds acting in ways, and I see people make this remark, they say, my God, he's acting like a toddler. He's having a toddler tantrum. And what I say to people is, yes, you are correct. It's almost not that he's acting like a toddler. In many ways, he is actually an emotional toddler. Because what happens, they are emotionally arrested at that point in their development. That's when things went awry. That's when they did not get the lessons and the role modeling from a normal parent that they needed. And they did not progress past the mechanisms that a toddler has in order to get his needs fulfilled. Because children have to manipulate in certain ways. They don't have a sophisticated vocabulary. They don't have the experience, but they can do things like cry and sort of grasp when they need something. And these people are stuck in that mode. They really are toddlers at the emotional level.
Yes, arrested development is the word. And it's funny that you say manipulate, because I would agree that toddlers can manipulate. Babies can't manipulate. There's some people who think babies manipulate, like babies are expressing their needs, but I could see it sometimes with my toddler, and it's quite funny because you can tell what he's doing. And you're right. It's, if I would act in such a way with my toddler now, where he was having a tantrum when trying to get his needs met, or doing something kind of manipulative to get his mom on his side or his dad on his side, and we would react in such a way that would over and over again just induce shame, then of course that child is going to be stuck there. They don't move out of that narcissistic phase, right? Where everything is about me when I'm a toddler. So they kind of stay there. But it's interesting too, though, Josh, because not everybody who grows up in that environment ends up with the false self in that sense, right? There's also the other side of the coin, or there's kind of traits of things, fleas, I call them, that you kind of have to grow out of and you have to deal with. And we've spoken about this in your podcast as well. So,
yeah. Well, as we get to the end of this conversation, I want to ask you sort of a general question. if we see, because a lot of what you're writing to the audience, I would say a big part of the audience that you are trying to reach in your writing are millennials, people your age, who many of whom are experiencing these dynamics in their families of origin and seeing some of them repeated in their own marriages, and trying to figure out a way out of it. So if we see, and I'm speaking generally, doesn't apply to everybody, but these are millennial cohort traits, they're identifiable. If we see millennials as having a distorted view of what it means to be an adult, and I think that's a fair characterization. I think there's a lot of immaturity and a lot of childlike behavior in fully grown millennials. And if they haven't achieved their emotional maturity because their boomer parents or their Gen X parents didn't give them those tools, you are doing some of that yourself. You've had to invent this yourself in your own life because there wasn't somebody else to show you the example. What would be just your basic advice to start out for that millennial who wants to do what you're doing and get a grasp on this?
Every time you feel yourself going into victim mode, stop it. That's the most simple thing that you can do. That has been the hardest thing for me to do, because that is kind of the infantile state of operating, in a sense. Like, things don't go your way. Somebody says something that you don't like, you get offended. Somebody doesn't respect your boundaries, and you go into victim mode. You feel like this big victim, and you are kind of resentful. Either you want somebody to come rescue you, or you just want to blame the persecutor. You can just get stuck in your own psychological trash can and have a really hard time coming out of it. So you have to take personal responsibility. If you want to be psychologically free, the same thing with any other kind of freedom, you have to take responsibility for that psychological freedom. So that means examining your own dark side. That means saying, sometimes it's hard when you're caught in the moment. But I've been able to do this more and more, and having a partner too who helps me to do that, to say, like, I'm calling your bullshit right now. That's very helpful. You don't want somebody who's going to coddle you, some kind of beta. You want somebody who's going to be able to say, hey, look, you're acting like really badly right now, and you should take some time to chill out. And then to be like, okay, you know what? I don't need this person to take care of my feelings. Learn to take care of your own feelings as well. Like, the millennial generation, in a way, my thesis, and I write about that in my piece on Substack, grew up taking care of the feelings of their boomer parents. And so they were responsible somehow for their feelings, but never really came to terms with their own feelings, and then kind of grew up into this cultural environment and this economic environment where it was hard to grow up, and it was hard to, buy a home or to get a good job. There's all of those elements as well. So it's easy for millennials to get stuck into their kind of infantilized state, at once being parentified and taking care of everybody else, but for themselves, staying like at home, like watching Netflix and sucking their thumbs, basically. You don't need to do that. You can say, hey, look, I've got some issues, because we all do. I'm going to, every time that I feel like the victim, I'm just going to stop. And I'm just going to go do something else. I'm going to go listen to a good podcast. I'm going to go listen to some good music. I'm going to go do something menial. I'm going to wash the dishes. And I'm going to just like calm my body down, calm my brain down, get out of fight or flight or fawn mode. And after that, I can say, okay, what was my role in the situation? Try and be more objective about what's going on. And that will help you grow immensely. Sometimes somebody else was more the bad actor. Sometimes it's you. Sometimes it is you. So realizing that is emotional maturity. I think that would be my takeaway from millennials.
It's good advice. And the piece I would tack onto it is, as somebody who has to remind himself to do these things for myself too, because I can get into victim mode. It takes a lot of practice, and you're going to stumble many times, and you're going to have to do it over and over and over again. Some of you will pick it up more easily. Other people who are more hard-headed like me will have to stumble many, many, many more times, but keep practicing doing it. Kate, we're going to close up here. but I want to make sure everybody knows where they can find your work online. So your Substack is Unorthodox Opinions. Are there other places that you write or put out podcasts or, I shudder to say, create content?
I'm a content creator. Yes. Well, actually,
I had
I had a podcast that was more on, politics and liberty and things like that. And I was, kind of in the middle of that for a few years, but I've put that on the ice. Now I'm really focused on my Substack, but I'm thinking of starting up a podcast more on this kind of personal philosophy, because that's where my writing has taken me. You can complain about all of the problems in the world. I really love what you're doing, Josh, because I love how you talk about the cluster B society with concrete examples and wrap it in with the personal. I think that's really great. So for now, if anybody wants to find my work, including upcoming work and upcoming projects, just go to katewand.substack.com. Or my URL actually leads there as well. It's very-opinionated.com. And that will lead to Unorthodox Opinions. That will lead you to Substack, which also has all of my old podcasts, and maybe something coming soon in the future with more video work there as well.
Excellent. Well, remember, everybody, make sure you're subscribed to us on audio, not just on Rumble and YouTube. We appreciate that, but subscribe on your podcast player because we've got a nice long conversation coming out with Kate soon. Kate Wand, thank you very much for joining us. It's nice to meet you on camera.
Yes, it's been really great. Thank you so much, Josh. And I definitely encourage people as well to go check out that full podcast because it was a great conversation. We had a lot of fun and I really enjoyed being here with you as well on video. So thank you so much. And to everyone listening too.
Excellent. Thank you. All right, we are going to go to a break, but I want to remind you that if you would like an hour with somebody who understands cluster B, who understands family dysfunction, the sorts of things we're talking about with Kate, I'm available to you through my website, joshuaslocum.net. I'm an educated layman. It's not therapy, but it's therapy adjacent. And we can talk about cluster B problems in your family, at work, in social situations, or anything else. Or if you just want, as many people do, and I enjoy talking to all of my clients, there are some people who book an hour with me simply because, in their words, they want to talk to someone who sees the same things they do, even if they don't have a particular problem. So if you want to do that, again, I'm available for you, joshuaslocum.net, and come back and see us after the break, and we'll finish up the show.
Disaffected is now streaming on X. Come with us each Sunday and dare to notice reality. You can find us on X at DisaffectedPod.
Welcome back. You've probably seen several of the clips of the hearings to confirm Bobby Kennedy Jr. as Secretary of Health and Human Services. And last week, we talked about the Harpy women who were absolutely losing their minds on Pete Hegseth. But this week, it's the men. Bernie Sanders is the absolute queen of the Harpies, honey. I couldn't believe how he beshitted himself in public going after Bobby Kennedy. Let's roll that, please, 301.
You have started a group called the Children's Health Defense. You're the originator. Right now, as I understand it, on their website, they are selling what's called onesies. These are little things, clothing for babies. One of them is titled Unfaxed, Unafraid. Next one, and they're sold for $26 a piece, by the way. Next one is No Vax, No Problem. Now, you're coming before this committee and you say you're pro-vaccine. Just want to ask some questions. And yet your organization is making money selling a child's product to parents for $26, which casts fundamental doubt on the usefulness of vaccines. Can you tell us now that you are pro-vaccine, that you're going to have your organization take these products off the market?
Senator, I have no power over that organization. I'm not part of it. I resigned from the board.
That was just a few months ago. You founded that. You certainly have power. You can make that call.
I've-
Are you supportive of this?
I've had nothing to do with
Are you
leadership.
supportive of these onesies?
I'm supportive of vaccines.
Are you supportive of this clothing, which is militantly anti-vaccine?
I am supportive of vaccines. I will. I want good science, and I want to protect.
But you will
vaccines.
not tell the organization you founded not to continue selling that product. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Are you supportive of these onesies? These onesies. Will you take this off the market? They're selling them for $26 a piece, by the way. Bertie, shut the fuck up. You're a multimillionaire. You're a multimillionaire who conspicuously drives a little used red Honda Fit so that you can project an image to people that you're a man of the people. It is so obnoxious. I know that politically these hearings are always a farce. It's an insult to the candidates, to the legislature, and to us, the American people. And I know that Bobby can't do this, but I really wish he would have said something like, not only do I not have control over that organization, Senator Sanders, but even if I did, the answer is no. I'm not going to tell them to take them off the market because people are allowed to say what they want about vaccines. And I don't even have to be pro-vaccine in order to be qualified for this job. That is not the issue. Maybe someday we'll get to that. All right, let's stay on the topic of health. I got some things to say about what happened over the past 4 years. This is adapted from a Substack essay. Our fear of death, our pathological fear of death, and it is pathological, it's a mental disturbance in most of our minds. That made the COVID pandemic possible. My involvement with the funeral and burial industry gave me what I needed to recognize that the alleged pandemic was a manufactured crisis, and that recognition came quickly within about 3 weeks in the spring of 2020. For 20 years, I was the executive director of a nonprofit organization called Funeral Consumers Alliance. Think of FCA as the Consumer Reports magazine of the funeral and burial purchase. Our mission was twofold. Number one, to educate the public about their commercial and their legal and their private options for funerals, burials, and cremations, with an eye to educating them about the sales techniques and deception that can pad the burial bill, which often exceeds $10,000 when it does not need to. Number two, it was also our job to lobby state and federal governments when necessary to rein in the excesses of the funeral trade, mainly by requiring honest price and service disclosures upfront to grieving consumers and by stopping monopolistic practices that drove the cost of burial up. During my 20 years there, I wrote state legislation, some of which became law. I co-drafted federal regulations, testified to Congress, testified to state legislatures. I went on 60 Minutes. I showed up in the New York Times, CBS News, ABC, and NPR advocating for grieving consumers. The whole lot. I personally spoke to tens of thousands of Americans and American families who were dealing with a death and who were in grief and who were trying to avoid financial heartache. As you can imagine, most funeral directors didn't like me very much. I was the enemy, but I had enough contact with enough of them. And some of them were actual friends, and some of them were just honest frenemies. And that's an honest way to be as well. I had enough contact to get an understanding of the day-to-day business of hauling bodies, embalming, cremation, and burial. And that gives me a baseline knowledge that very few Americans have because it's just not something we know very much about. I have watched death happen. I have touched it. I have hauled bodies from one building to another. I've smelled it. I've experienced both the commerce and the emotions that accompany death. I know what death is actually like in the mundane real world. And I can tell you that very, very few Americans know anything realistic or truthful about it because we banished death from our lives. Before the last quarter of the 19th century, there was no such thing in America or anywhere really as a funeral home or a funeral industry. There was your family, your own family, your parent, your great grandparents still participated in this, most of you listening, washed and laid out your own dead mother or father at home. The undertaker in those days was really a coffin maker. Most of them came out of the furniture and cabinet working shop on Main Street. They acted as a coffin maker and a general helper out who came to your home with a coffin, put the body in there, brought extra chairs for those who would gather. No one in those days asked questions like, should I let my children go to the funeral? Because what could that possibly mean? I mean, what are you going to do? Lock the children up in the barn until the body is buried? The funeral was taking place in the front room, in the front parlor. And the corpse would be spending a couple of days there. That was normal. Very few children got out of their early years without being exposed to the reality of death. And not only because they saw livestock being slaughtered, they did, but because their grandparents died and they were washed and waked at home in the front bay window. Those children, you can be pretty sure, grew up largely without the hysterical neuroticism about death because it was never hidden from them. There was no black velvet curtain hiding the truth so that the mind came up with all sorts of phantasmagoric fantasies. And then came chemical embalming after the Civil War. So the undertaker set about replacing all the blood in the body with rose-tinted formaldehyde to give the illusion of life while preserving the corpse cosmetically for a few days when refrigeration had not yet been invented. Makeup, of course, was once reserved for actors and whores, but then became worn by every well-dressed corpse. They called it the beautiful memory picture. The body was segregated from the world of the living by being encased in an ornate box that we call a casket with soft torchère lighting sitting at either end of the coffin. And you only got to see it unboxed at a funeral home, a special cordoned off place for death so that it might no longer contaminate your living space. Most Americans today have never seen a corpse with their own eyes. Those who have usually only seen an embalmed, made up, and well-lit, mannequin-like representation of a loved one. In the absence of real-world experience, we have become stark, staring, terrified of natural death. We think that without immediate chemical preservation, that grandma within a few hours will turn into something that stinks and shambles like in The Walking Dead. We believe falsely that we can actually get a sickness or a disease from simply being around a corpse or even being in contact with a corpse. None of this is true. It's not true. It's never been true. But you cannot convince most people of this because we've made sure that we never have to encounter the reality of death. And we built up enough neurosis that for many people, that is never going to go away. Now, obviously, I'm not the first person to notice this by far. Much has been written by philosophers, authors, and researchers for more than 100 years about the modern terror of death and its consequences on our psyche and how we live our lives. But I will tell you this. Without this modern terror, the government's oppressive reaction to the alleged pandemic could never have happened. It is our childish, desperate immaturity about death that softened us up to having our constitutional rights taken away, to having our businesses closed, to be forced to take dangerous and unproven injections, and to unperson our own friends and family, remaking them into vectors of death and doom. We are not a sane people. So how did my professional knowledge show me in the first few weeks that the pandemic was a complete scam and that everybody was going to lose their minds over it? Because I saw what was going on behind the scenes. I saw what egotistical public health people were doing to seize their moment. And I saw the eager media ready to scare the bejesus out of everyone for no good reason but ratings. The moment those pictures of overrun hospitals in Italy were shown on your screen, the moment that I saw the phrase refrigerated morgue truck in print, I knew the country was going to fall, and it did exactly what I knew it was going to do. Let's just take one example, refrigerated morgue trucks, to illustrate what happened. You may remember reading breathtaking stories from the early days of the alleged pandemic about how crematories were being overrun. There were too many bodies to deal with, so they had to bring in refrigerated morgue trucks. You can hear the capital letters. Refrigerated morgue trucks, be afraid. Tractor trailers with refrigeration and shelving became a palimpsest on which the entire public wrote all of its fears and terrors of disgusting, contaminating, evil death. But I knew what most people still don't know. And here it is. Those refrigerated morgue trucks have always been around, and you never knew what they were because they don't have signs on the sign that say Acme Rolling Mortuary. It's mortumatic. Whenever a crematory in Alabama, or California, or New York City, or any place that you like, whenever it has too many bodies to cremate them all in a couple of days, and then they run out of refrigeration space at the crematory, you get a refrigerated morgue truck. This happens at hospital morgues as well. This happens in most flu seasons. And it happens from time to time because the death rate is not linear. It's lumpy. It goes up and down. Sometimes there's a lot of dead people this week and not very many dead people next week. None of these refrigerated morgue trucks were anything unusual. They only seemed that way because the news never talks about them or shows pictures of them unless there's a natural disaster or some other acute mass death. But they're rolling out on your highways every day. You have driven by them in neighborhoods. You just didn't know what they were. There are trucks full of coffins from the coffin factory that go by you on the highway all the time, and I know it because I see them. It's just that you don't know what the brand name Batesville stands for. I do. It's the Batesville Casket Company. So if you're ever driving by a truck that says Batesville on it, it's full of caskets. Freak out. But my God, the shrieking, terrified hysteria around these refrigerated morgue trucks in the early days of COVID, I knew where the country was going to go in the beginning because the media started calling me to get an interview. They were pushing me to give them dire-sounding quotations. They'd say, what about the refrigerated morgue trucks? What about the overrun crematories? They would gasp. I gave them the same calm, ordinary explanation that I've given to you. But not only did that not satisfy the media people, but I could detect a low-key resentment from some of them and some bit of pissed offedness when I wouldn't react the way they wanted me to. I wasn't giving them the guts and gore that they wanted. And if you actually asked me if they thought I was being too light, too glib, and not taking a public health emergency seriously enough. This is what the media does. This is what they do behind the scenes. If they find an honest and rational source, they either ignore him or they find someone else more hysterical to drown him out. What they won't do is let you, the consumer of news, hear that calm voice of reason. Obviously, I was right in the spring of 2020, and many other people were too. America did exactly what I predicted it would do, except it went much farther than even a cynic like me would have predicted. And it was all possible because not more than a few out of every 1,000 Americans has a sane, rational, or proportionate relationship with death. And that's the show. Thanks for joining us. We really appreciate all of you, and we'll see you again next Sunday.